To truly understand how a country rips itself in half, you have to smell the gunpowder. History cannot be understood when it's locked in glass cases and buried in silent, dusty textbooks. I needed to see it for myself. So, I built the AIVOM machine, a time machine that can transport me to any time and location of my choosing. Today, we're firing it up to track down the most influential leaders of the Civil War.
We aren't just studying them. We're going to stand in the room while they make the calls.
So here's the plan. I want to focus on the most influential people from the Union and the Confederacy. I'm working my way from the beginning and want to show you real photographs and then go back to the moment they were taken.
Let's activate this machine, head back to 1854, and take a look at the American Antebellum Era.
Our first photo to go find starts with Stephen A. Douglas. A prominent Illinois senator who promoted the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which further divided the nation over slavery. In 1858, he engaged in highly publicized debates with Abraham Lincoln, and later ran as the Northern Democratic candidate in the pivotal 1860 presidential election. Next up, Charles Sumner, a radical Republican senator from Massachusetts who delivered the fiery "Crime Against Kansas" speech in 1856 and was brutally assaulted with a cane on the Senate floor by Preston Brooks, turning his empty desk into a powerful symbol of sectional tension. Dred Scott, an enslaved man who stood at the center of the 1857 Supreme Court case Dred Scott versus Sanford. The decision denied citizenship to African Americans, seemingly guaranteed slavery's spread, and deeply alienated the North. Next, John Brown, a fervent abolitionist who orchestrated the 1859 raid on the federal arsenal at Harpers Ferry. His goal was to incite a slave uprising, and his execution severely intensified national tensions, setting the stage for the Civil War. John J. Crittenden, a Kentucky politician who desperately tried to avert war in late 1860 and early 1861 by proposing the Crittenden Compromise, which would have protected slavery below the Missouri Compromise line. Now we find ourselves in 1860. Abraham Lincoln was just elected as the 16th president from the newly formed Republican Party. But first we focus on the outgoing administration with a crisis on its hands. James Buchanan. During the final months of his presidency in the winter of 1860 to 1861, James Buchanan watched helplessly as the nation fractured when South Carolina seceded from the Union, paving the way for Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas to follow suit. Although he officially refused to recognize the secession, his leadership failed during this crisis because he simultaneously refused to use force to coerce the seceding states back into the Union. Instead of taking decisive action, Buchanan unsuccessfully sought to appease Southern slaveholders through ineffective compromises, ultimately leaving the escalating crisis for his successor to inherit. Jefferson Davis, inaugurated as the provisional president of the Confederate States of America in February 1861. A former West Point graduate and U.S. Secretary of War, he oversaw the Southern war effort but struggled to balance the demands of a centralized war with the South's philosophy of states' rights. Alexander H. Stephens, chosen in February 1861 as the Vice President of the Confederacy. Though initially a moderate and reluctant secessionist, he became increasingly at odds with Jefferson Davis over the central government's growing powers. James Murray Mason, a Virginia senator who withdrew from the U.S. Senate in March 1861 to join the Confederacy. In November 1861, he was seized from a British ship in the Trent Affair, sparking a major diplomatic crisis between the U.S. and Great Britain. The crisis only worsened. The Confederates weren't just passing laws, they were preparing for war. Immediately, the newly formed Confederacy began systematically capturing federal forts, arsenals, and property from the U.S. government. Before a single official battle was even fought, the South had already authorized a massive army of 100,000 men. The board was set. All they needed was a spark. That spark? Fort Sumter. Sitting as an island fortress nearly 4 miles off the coast from Charleston, and where 4 months earlier the birth of the rebellion began. The South claimed the fort sat on their soil and demanded it. The North? They were drawing a red line. In April 1861, the standoff broke. President Lincoln made the decision to send an unarmed ship to resupply his starving troops inside the fort. The Confederacy felt backed into a corner. Their response? The Civil War had begun. The man who gave the order was P.G.T. Beauregard, a Louisiana-born general of magnificent self-regard. He had been a student of the Union officer now trapped inside the fort. Now he was ordering his former professor to surrender. Robert Anderson had done everything possible to avoid exactly this moment. He'd delayed, negotiated, hoped. But his garrison was running out of food, his walls were crumbling, and now 34 hours of Confederate cannon fire had left Fort Sumter a burning ruin. He lowered the flag. He surrendered. In Washington, Abraham Lincoln read the news and made a decision that would define the next 4 years. He called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. That call for troops pushed the Upper South over the edge. Virginia seceded. North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas. The Confederacy had doubled in size overnight. Immediately, Washington, D.C. became a city in controlled panic, with soldiers pouring in from every direction. The Union Army was, at this point, barely an army. 75 years of peace had left it tiny, scattered, and woefully unprepared. General Winfield Scott, a 74-year-old American hero, too heavy to ride a horse and suffering from vertigo. He was also the greatest military mind America had produced since George Washington. While politicians screamed for a quick march to Richmond, Scott proposed something different, something far-sighted and far more cruel. Blockade the entire Confederate coastline, seize the Mississippi River, strangle the South slowly like an anaconda constricting its prey. The press mocked it. They called it the Anaconda Plan. But Scott was right. It was exactly how the North would eventually win. Rose O'Neal Greenhow, a prominent Washington socialite and Confederate spy. In July 1861, she smuggled coded messages tucked into a courier's hair to General Beauregard, providing crucial warning of Union troop movements. 30 miles west of Washington, D.C., the first major battle of war is about to begin, in a field near a creek called Bull Run. Most believed this would be a short war, and many Washington residents and politicians made the short trip to witness the battle, as 35,000 Union soldiers met 32,000 Confederates. P.G.T. Beauregard faced the oncoming Union Army at a place called Bull Run, and in the opening hours, the Confederates were bending, breaking, retreating up Henry House Hill. Then a Confederate general named Barnard B. looked to his right and saw a brigade that was not running. A Virginia general standing his men like a wall of stone. "There stands Jackson," B. reportedly shouted, "like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians." Thomas Stonewall Jackson earned his nickname in that single moment, and it fit, because Stonewall Jackson was a man made of stone, brilliant, eccentric, utterly without fear, and absolutely certain that God was guiding every bullet. And so, as the dust settles over the fields of Manassas, our journey through time pauses here, standing in the wreckage of what so many in the North believed would be a quick and painless war. The Battle of Bull Run didn't just shatter an army, it shattered an illusion. The Union had marched into Virginia with picnic baskets and spectators in tow, convinced this rebellion would be crushed in a matter of weeks. Instead, they ran. And in that retreat, the entire nation, North and South, was forced to confront a terrifying truth. This war was only just beginning. Bull Run gave the Confederacy confidence, handed Lincoln a crisis of command, and lit a fire under a Union that now had no choice but to get serious. Part 1 of our story ends here, in chaos, in defeat, and in the painful first steps of a nation tearing itself apart. But our travels through time are far from over. In Part 2, we go deeper into the storm. New generals will rise, the stakes will climb higher than anyone dared imagine, and the war will begin to demand a cost no one was prepared to pay. You will not want to miss what comes next. If you're riding with us through history, make sure you're subscribed to AIVOM, drop a like on this video, and ring that notification bell, because we're just getting started, and history is about to get a whole lot heavier.